glad that you are here. And in case you didn't know, I found my scarf. I believe in the God of miracles. And to prove once again that Jesus and God are Eagles fans, I turn to Isaiah chapter 40. Side screens, please. For those youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait 58 years for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. Fly. Eagles fly. Caw-caw. Caw-caw. That's a little pop culture reference for you in case you didn't know. But yes, it's just been a great month, hasn't it? Just good to be a Philly fan. And so now that football is over, I can officially switch over to college basketball, which Carolina did beat Duke. And then yesterday they beat NC State. So I'm just in a good place today. So if you're a guest with us today, my name is Jason. I'm the pastor here at the church and just want to extend a welcome to you and to all of us here who call Mission Community Church our church home. If you're tuning in online, thanks for checking us out. And for those of you who may be a guest with us, we're in the middle of a new series called Uncontainable. And really, we're looking at 7 miracles in the Gospel of John. John's really perspective on 7 miracles that Jesus performed during his life and ministry. And so just to kind of bring a little bit of a recap of where we've been the last several weeks, there's really these 4 miracles that we've studied. We're going to hit number 5 today. And to recap on those, the first miracle that Jesus performs that John records is this water turning into wine. That this master carpenter becomes a master winemaker. And it's a miracle that's not so much about saving a life, it's more so about saving face. And one of the things that we learn in this miracle is that not only is Jesus concerned about our eternal lives, he's concerned about our everyday lives, the here and now. And then we turn to the second miracle in John, and we learn about this guy who's been laying by this pool for 38 years, and he's surrounded by the superstition that if he could just get into that pool first, when these pools start to swirl, that sometime in some way he'll be able to walk once again. But what Jesus shows in this miracle is that the superstitions don't actually invoke the supernatural. They may actually even revoke the supernatural. And that God has the supernatural ability to overcome any superstitious tendencies that we may have. We also learn about Jesus healing this boy from more than 20 miles away when this official comes and approaches him and says, "You have to heal my son. He's dying of a fever." And just with the speech from his mouth says, "Your son will live." And it shows that he's Lord over longitude and latitude, that time and space cannot contain him. And then if you were with us last week, we learned that Jesus is the ultimate authority over arithmetic, and that basic addition doesn't stand up to his ability to multiply, and that he is ultimately our provider. And so today we turn our attention again to John chapter 6, and we look at the 5th miracle that's recorded in this gospel. And so if you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn to John chapter 6. We'll read verses 16 through 21 this morning. And if you would, I invite you to stand out of honor of God's word as we read this together. You can go ahead and just follow along as I read this over us this morning. So John chapter 6, starting in verse 16. So John writes, "When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the Sea of Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was on the land to which they were going." And God bless the reading of his word. And so I've entitled today's message, "A Waltz on the Waves." How many of you here have a significant other with you in your presence this morning? All right, for those of you who don't, or maybe are looking for a significant other and you don't have a significant other, turn to that person. And for those of you who do have your significant other, and ask them before you sit down, would you care to tango? Go ahead. And then go ahead and take a seat. One of the things that we have to do with this particular miracle today is actually join it with the miracle that we studied last week, the feeding of not the 5,000, but really the feeding of the 20,000. These miracles actually happen right back to back, that Jesus walking on water happens on the heels of his feeding this mass group of people. And the reason why we have to put these two miracles together is because, and I'm going to get through the story, but once Jesus gets back onto the boat, the storm calms down, and the disciples, it says in Mark chapter 6, that they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And so it's interesting to me that Jesus calms a storm, but they're still stumped about the bread and the fish. And so we have to kind of connect these two miracles together, and that's what my goal is this morning. Because what happens is when we see Jesus taking 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and multiplying them amongst 20,000 people, we ultimately learn that Jesus is our provider. That when we think we're in want or in need, he is the one that ultimately provides for those needs. The disciples have been teaching all day. If you remember from last week, they're teaching all day, and they come back to Jesus, and they give a report of all that they have done and all that they had taught. And Jesus recognizes that they just need to rest. And so they say, or Jesus says to his disciples, hey, I want you to go across the sea. You see this little grassy knoll over here. I want you to go there and rest and wait for me. But what happens is that the word gets out that Jesus and his disciples are going to meet to this place. And this is at a point in time in Jesus' ministry where it's starting to explode. Like there's these whisperings going around that this guy turned water into wine. There's whisperings going around that this guy healed this man that wasn't able to walk for 38 years. There's whisperings going around that Jesus was able to heal this boy from 20 miles away. His reputation is being out there as a miracle worker. And so word gets out that Jesus and his disciples are going to meet in this grassy knoll. And what happens when the disciples get to this place that Jesus told them to go, this great crowd had already gathered. It says in the Gospels that Jesus had compassion over this crowd because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so when he was going to pour into his disciples, he actually takes time and starts teaching the mass of people. And if you remember from last week, that we learned that it was actually the disciples who were hungry and not necessarily the crowd. And that as Jesus got up and started teaching, you can kind of see the disciples rolling their eyes. Oh my goodness, here he goes. He's going to be at it for the next couple of hours and we're hungry. And then as Jesus starts to wrap up his teaching, he's starting to kind of push Jesus, the disciples, to try to get the crowds to leave so that they can go get their food and eat. And what Jesus does is so interesting. He turns it back on the disciples and says, you go feed them. So they kind of look at their supplies and they see a little lad's lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish. And kind of in a sarcastic way, they come back to Jesus and say, what are we supposed to do with this? How are we going to feed a mass of people with just this little lad's lunch? And he says, gives thanks and starts breaking that bread. Now try to put yourself in the disciples' shoes. As you read through that story in the different Gospels, it shares that the disciples actually placed this mass of people in groups of 50 to 100. And so Jesus is there breaking these 5 loaves of bread, breaking these fish. And so the disciples are going up to Jesus, loading up their serving trays, going out amongst the crowds, distributing it in one group at a time. And as that tray gets empty, brings that tray back to Jesus and fills it back up again. And you can imagine just going back and forth. I thought we just had 5 loaves and 2 fish. How is this happening? You try to put yourself in that place. That as Jesus is breaking, it's just continuing to multiply. As he's distributing the fish, it's just continuing to multiply. One of the reasons why I believe that Jesus is walking on water is right on the heels of feeding the 20,000 people. It's because Jesus sometimes balances our blessings with battles to reveal our true beliefs. Let me say that again, that sometimes Jesus balances our blessings with battles in order to reveal our true beliefs. I mean, think about it for a minute. It's really when we're pressured, it's really when we're stressed, it's really when we're under some sort of difficult situation that our true selves come out, that our true beliefs come out, that we have a tendency in Christianity to think we believe what we think we believe, but it's not until we're in the heat of battle that those beliefs actually come out. And so let me just harp in a little bit on this idea of battles revealing our true beliefs. If you remember back to Christmas, if you were with us, I continued referencing these gifts that we were looking for our kids, or that they were asking of us. Dean wanted the Carson Wentz jersey. Shane wanted the PlayStation. And Ellie wanted her Barbie dream house. And what happened is, we were able to bless our kids with those things. And so what has happened since then is, with PlayStation, it's kind of like in a family event that we're on there playing games each week, and they love it. Dean loves his Madden, and Shane loves his Ninjago, and all these games that we're playing together. And we're really wanting to bless them with these things. But I will readily admit that I am one of those parents that will use that blessing as a bribe when I want Shane to do something that I need him to do. Don't look at me badly. I know you do the same thing. And so here's a blessing. Over the last couple of weeks, however, Shane's been in the battle of his life. This kid is terrified of losing a tooth. Absolutely terrified. He's had this tooth for, I kid you not, for the last probably 2 weeks that has been dangling by a thread. I mean, it's a snaggle tooth. It's sticking out in all kinds of different directions. And I've been just begging Shane to allow me to pick this tooth out right from his mouth. He's terrified, though. And what happens is I try to convince him, hey, it's going to be better when this thing's out. It's not going to hurt as much. And he's crying. He doesn't want to lose the tooth. He's scared. Enter bribe. PlayStation. Shane, you're not going to be able to play your PlayStation until you let me get that tooth out. And you can feel the dilemma rising up in his heart. It's so frustrating to him. And so as a parent, good parent that I am, I just bribe him. I said, it's not going to happen until you let me pull that tooth out. And he's in a battle. He's scared. And I'm trying to take this opportunity as a dad to speak into a young son and say, you know what, there's going to be moments in life when you're going to get scared. There's going to be some difficult situations and decisions that you're going to have to make. And it might even be painful for a little bit, but in the end, it's going to be a lot better. Let me just grab that tooth. Wrestled with this for a whole week. He didn't play any PlayStation. Until one day, he finally gave in and allowed me to pull that tooth out, to pluck it right out. And to be honest, I didn't even really have to pull the thing. I kind of pinched it and it came right out. And said, Shane, wasn't that just okay? Wasn't that bad? It wasn't scary? Didn't it hurt that much? And right away he's like, well, can I play PlayStation now? And so we start launching and we're playing Ninjago. The reason why I share that is because I think sometimes our faith is only limited to the blessings that we receive. And then when hard times come and battles come, that our faith is often questioned, or we question our faith. And what Jesus is trying to get at is that he doesn't want just pampered children. I do believe that as a heavenly Father, God wants to bless us as his children. But he doesn't want to just raise pampered children and give us whatever we want. He ultimately wants perfected sons and daughters. And when I use that term perfected, what I mean is really mature sons and daughters. That God is more concerned about our holiness than he is about our happiness. And so think back to the disciples for a minute. They had just witnessed this mass miracle. This spiritual blessing of multiplication that God is their ultimate provider. And right on the heels of this miracle, they are sent out to sea and they're battling themselves in a storm. Think about this for a moment. That right after the blessing, it's actually Jesus who sends the disciples into that storm. If you turn to Mark chapter 6 and verse 45, it says this, that immediately he, Jesus, made his disciples get into the boat. You know, one of the beliefs that we have about God is that he is omniscient. It's really just a word that means that he is all-knowing. There's nothing outside of his knowledge. And so one of the assumptions we can make is that Jesus knew that the disciples were going to sail right into a storm. And that there was actually a purpose in him making them get into the boat and go out into the sea and enter into that storm right on the heels of this mass blessing. And what's amazing to me is that many of us, we can come into church week after week, we can experience some sort of a blessing, or we can experience whatever blessing may happen, but then right after that, we enter into some sort of battle and we end up questioning God. God, why have you forsaken me? We're really no different than the disciples, that when they're out there struggling and battling and they don't know what's going on, why? And we do the very same thing. Let me expound on this battle that the disciples went through, this storm. I believe that every minute detail in the Bible is intended for us to kind of get a picture of what God is trying to say. I think we have a picture when we talk about Jesus walking on the water, at least for me, we have this picture of kind of Jesus walking on this kind of sea of glass. Everything's calm. It's a nice little mist coming up off of the water. But this was actually a big storm. Listen to what it says in John chapter 6, verse 18, that the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. In Mark chapter 14, it says that the ship was beaten by the waves. And then in Mark chapter 6, it says that they were making headway painfully. So here you have a group of fishermen who are used to being out on rough seas, and they are having a difficult time. They are in a battle right in the middle of this sea. If you know anything about the Sea of Galilee, it's about 8 miles wide and 17 miles long. And at its deepest place, it's about 157 feet. It's a little bit of an interesting terrain. The Sea of Galilee actually sits 700 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded by mountains. And so this is really a recipe for some spectacular storms to develop. Have you ever experienced the crippling power of a wave? The ocean. I grew up here in the Northeast and spent many summers on the shores of New Jersey. And then also growing up, we as a family would always go down to North Carolina and spend a week at the Outer Banks, and we would wrestle down a little bit further to Sunset Beach the last 10 years or so. And there were many a times when the Atlantic Ocean body slammed me into the ocean floor. I can actually remember one time I was probably 10th or 11th grade in North Carolina, and I'm a big body surfer and a big boogie boarder, and I love getting out in the ocean whenever I can. And there was just one day when the surf was kind of a good size for us surfers. There was about 6 or 7 feet waves. And I remember just spending time out there and having the day of my life. You always hope when you go on vacation you get at least one day of big waves. And I can remember this one time where I got on this wave, but I got on the wave a little behind, a little late, if you know what that means. And what happens is that the Atlantic Ocean actually pile drived me this time. That my head hit the ocean floor, and I'm pretty sure my feet hit the back of my head. And I can remember when I was in the water, one of the things that you're taught as a surfer is that when you get wipe out on a wave, you just kind of let your body go limp until it brings it to the surface. You're not really supposed to fight it. And I can remember thinking to myself as I'm just being tossed in this wave after going head first into the ocean floor, my head peeks out of the water and I'm breathing, but I'm wiggling one finger at a time and one toe at a time. I was for sure something went wrong. Fortunately, I came out of that okay, but I still experienced the power of just that wave. A couple years ago, Colleen and I went on a cruise, and we're in this massive cruise ship, this massive hotel floating on the water. And one night, the seas were kind of rough, and we're walking from one place to the other, and it was funny how as we're walking, everybody walking in the same direction of us are starting to kind of walk this way and then starting to walk over this way. And no, it wasn't because they had too much to drink. It was simply because this boat was rocking by the massive power of the waves. My point, Jesus didn't just walk on water. He didn't just go for a leisurely stroll on the sea. He actually waltzed the waves. Like, this was a massive storm that he enters into. According to science, a human being could run on water if a human being was able to run at 67 miles per hour. The fastest human being today, or at least clocked, is Usain Bolt, just under 28 miles per hour. The fact that this miracle happens in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, just makes it even that much more marvelous and mysterious. That it's, again, not just a leisurely stroll, it is a massive storm in which Jesus enters out into. But why are the disciples in the boat to begin with? Again, they're just following the orders of their captain. And so I often believe that Jesus sends battles on the heels of blessings to reveal our true beliefs. While the disciples are out in the sea battling the storms, the Gospels say that Jesus is up on the mountaintop praying. Listen to this. It says in Matthew chapter 14 that immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. And while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land. Again, back in John, it says they were about 3 or 4 miles from the shore. So the disciples are out in the middle of this sea, caught in a storm, perhaps wondering, why did Jesus send us out into this? Where is he even to begin with? What about when that happens to us? That we just come from some sort of spiritual high or some sort of spiritual blessing, and then right on the heels of that, everything goes good on Sunday, but Monday rolls around or Wednesday rolls around, and we have some battle with our boss or some battle with our children or some battle with health. Like, what do we do with that? Like, where is Jesus in all of this? Everything was going our way. Why all of a sudden am I in the middle of this battle? Interestingly, Jesus could see them struggling. It says that as he was out on the mountain praying, he could see them, the waves beating against the boat. And I think one of the perks of being God is that Jesus is right there with us in the middle of those storms, in the middle of those battles. But he's also looking out after us, ready to come deliver us from those places. He often uses the battles to reveal our true beliefs on the heels of blessings. And when Jesus shows up, the disciples freak out. So look at Mark chapter 6. It says about the fourth watch of the night. This is between 3 and 6 in the morning. It says that he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." You know, I find that relevant to us today. That the same Jesus who provides for us on the mountaintop is the same Jesus who protects us in the valley. That yes, he is our ultimate provider, but he is also our ultimate protector. I do believe, again, that God wants to bless his children. He wants to pamper us, but at the same time, he's more concerned about our holiness and our happiness. So he is going to perfect us often through the storms of life, through the battles that we face each and every day. I mean, it's easy if you think about it. It's easy to follow Jesus when things are going our way. It's easy when all of our needs are met. It's easy when all of our resources are available to us. It's easy to follow Jesus when things go our way. But when we're faced with some sort of battle, that's when our true beliefs come out. And we begin to question God. We begin to question his providence. We begin to question his care and protection. But the writer of Hebrews says this. He says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. We've been singing all morning that the God of the universe battled death for you and for me. And that ought to astound each and every one of us. That when we think about the battles that we go through in our lives, yes, they are difficult. I'm not trying to minimize those things, but the God of all creation, the God of all the universe came after you and came after me. He battled death so that we might have life in his name. He did no wrong. He's the perfect Son of God. And it says, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Yes, Jesus sometimes balances our blessings with battles in order to reveal our true beliefs. But there's also a point in all of that, again, to perfect our faith. There's more to this miracle, however, than just Jesus walking on water, than just Jesus waltzing on the waves. There's actually 4 miracles that occur in this one specific miracle. So the one that we just talked about, Jesus walking on water, he's more than just a water strider. He is managing the waves. But there's a couple of other things that happen in this miracle. This is recorded in 3 different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. The other part that happens, or one of the other miracles that occurs, is in Matthew chapter 14, when Peter actually gets out of the boat and walks on water, miracle number 2. Jesus also calms the storm as soon as he gets in the boat, miracle number 3. And then it says in John that as soon as he got in the boat immediately appeared on the shore, miracle number 4. So let's hone in a little bit on Peter's waltzing the waves. So it says in Matthew chapter 14, verse 28, and Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Even the disciples didn't really know yet who Jesus was until this specific miracle. They saw him turn water into wine. They saw him heal a lame man by a pool. They saw him heal a son by 20 miles away. They saw him do these miracles, but they just saw him at this point as a great teacher and as a prophet and as a great leader. They hadn't yet recognized him as the Son of God until we get through this miracle. They worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. But then we often give Peter a bad rap. Peter's one of these guys who's brash. He kind of puts his foot in his mouth. He does things irrationally. He gets kind of a bad rap, yet Peter's the only one who steps out of the boat. Matthew points out that Peter lost focus and therefore lost faith. And it's my experience with those who criticize water walkers that they're doing so from the comfortable confines of the boat. And I think one of the things that we learn from Peter getting out of the boat and walking on water is that we'd rather, take a risk to see what God might do than just sit comfortably in the confines of that boat. It's been said before, Pastor John Ortberg wrote a book that said if you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. And it's often that first step that is the hardest, isn't it? That when we see some faith step that we ought to take, it's actually that step in doing so that's the hardest. And so to borrow a phrase from a famous moonwalker, one small step can turn into one giant leap. When placing our trust in the hands of the God of miracles, it's often the small steps that he commands of us that turn into the giant leaps he has purposed for us. And a lot of times those small steps happen on the heels of the battles. But here's a principle that I want to lay before us today. That if you're going to step out of the boat and waltz on the waves like Peter did, you better be sure Jesus said come. And if Jesus said come, you better get out of the boat. And the discernment in that is hard. I get it. It is hard. It's easy to rationalize things away, but I'd rather make a few mistakes and perhaps sink a little bit than just sit in the comfort of a boat and not do anything at all. Most Christians are educated way beyond the level of their obedience. I shared this verse at the beginning of our series that Jesus says to his disciples. He says this in John chapter 14, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do." And if we didn't know that Jesus said that, it would almost seem blasphemous, heretical. That we are going to be able to do greater works than Jesus? Like, what does that mean? For the last several days, I'll try to use this as an illustration. We've been praying for one of our elders here at Mission. If you are unaware, Russ Whitner went in for a common stress test on Monday and found out that he has 6 blockages in his heart. Ends up in the hospital, goes into open heart surgery on Friday to have 4 bypasses over these 6 blockages. And even just think about that for a moment. Jesus says that you're going to do even greater works than these. Back in the disciples' day, it was Jesus performing these miracles, turning water into wine, healing the blind, causing the lame to walk. And I guarantee you that if we had the ability to take a doctor and to take a Russ Whitner and put him back in Jesus' time 2,000 years ago and to split him open, rewire some veins and arteries and bypass some of these blockages and put him back together and send him on his way, that would very much have been considered a miracle in that day. But here's what we do today in our culture. We explain it away. Well, that doctor had so many years of education. That doctor had so many years of residency and training. That doctor has performed X number of surgeries. And so then the expectation is if I'm going in for an open heart surgery, I'm going to come out okay because that doctor went through the necessary education and training to be able to get him to do what he's able to do. Instead of looking at it in the lens of a miracle, that you can open up someone, rewire some stuff, put him back together, and the doctor says, you're amazing, you're going to live forever. There's no heart damage, there's no issues. Now, yeah, he's going to be sore for a couple of weeks, obviously a couple of months, but that is a miracle. And if we can open our eyes to the miracles that are happening all around us, even when we're in the middle of a battle and Jesus is asking us to take that step of faith, really, that step of faith is just a step of obedience. When Jesus says come, we come. When Jesus says worship him, we worship him. When Jesus says go down this path, we go down this path. And as we take one step of obedience after another step of obedience, it's only a matter of time before we find ourselves trafficking in the miraculous. You know, I've said this every week that we've been in this series, that it's not about chasing after miracles. It's about chasing after the God of miracles and becoming so intimately connected with him that there's no explanation of what's happening around us other than God's hand is upon it. That my prayer for me and my family and for us as a church is that we would be so in tune with the Holy Spirit's leading that we bob when he says bob, we duck when he says duck, we take that big step when he says to take that big step. And as we continue to do that, he's going to put us right in the middle of a miracle. Sometimes that's in a battle. And it's not because he's wanting to destroy us. He's wanting to deliver us. He's wanting to perfect our faith in him. And as we see him continue to move and to provide and to protect, our faith increases. So that it's not surprising to us anymore that he moves in miraculous and incredible ways. And so if you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. One of my favorite definitions of faith is that faith is climbing out onto a limb, cutting it off, and watching the tree fall. I don't know what tree you might have to climb today. But if Jesus says come, come. Take that step of faith and watch him provide in just the way that he needs to provide in you. Let's stand together as we close in a word of prayer.